Hello, I am Chauncey DeVega. You may recognize my voice from Ring of Fire Radio with Mike Papantonio, the BBC, Sirius XM, or the Tom Hartman Radio Show. And you may have read some of my essays at places like Salon and Alternate. I would like to thank all of you for listening to, downloading, tweeting, and sharing the eponymously named podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show.
And they ran a story by somebody named Chauncey DeVega.
Quote, I find black garbage pail kids, black conservatives, fascinating.
It's just unbelievable. You know,
he goes by the name of Chauncey DeVega.
You know, I've been called Uncle Tom, Oreo, sellout, shameless, but this is a new one.
Well, let's talk now to Chauncey DeVega.
As my man Chauncey DeVega of the blog We Are Respectable Negroes says,
I have author and blogger Chauncey DeVega here with us.
Hello. I hope that all of our friends back east in the Nutmeg State, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, and elsewhere are warm and safe. You all were stuck in Hoth 2.0, sitting there in the ice and snow. I hope that the Wampa didn't come and get you. And if it did, I hope that you had a tauntaun to cut open and hide inside. Little Star Wars illusion there. But in all seriousness, I hope that our two-legged friends, our four-legged friends, and all the other wonderful creatures that are friends, fans, and supporters of the Chauncey DeVega Show, the eponymous podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show, and ChaunceyDeVega.com are safe, warm, and well. My mother, as I wrote about on the website, is in Connecticut, New Haven, right there on the Hamden-New Haven town line. And as is the habit of our older and wiser mentors, parents, friends, and others, she always insists on driving her car in bad weather. And I was like, Moms, they're saying the world's going to end. Don't you be out in that dang snow, because I don't want to have to be up here complaining and angry at you if you crash your car and I got to pay to fix it. So thank God Mom stayed inside, and governor in Connecticut, as well as other governors in New England, said, hey man, stay off the road. This is dangerous stuff. Another interesting aside about snowpocalypse is that I was named after a weatherman. Little Easter egg there for you. Who apparently committed fraud. He falsified his records and his resume and became an eminently popular meteorologist. He was outed. Then people complained and got him his job back. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But this is part 2 of our 2-part, I know that's repetitive, installment here on the Chauncey DeVega Show, where we're talking about hip-hop and popular culture. It is also the second episode of 2015. Really excited for it. Our first conversation with Jack Hamilton, pop music editor, Slate.com, about Biggie, about hip-hop studies, about race and the color line, pop music. If you didn't listen to that, please go and download that one, because that was a great conversation. Jack was just so wonderful, so giving, and so honest. So that was really, really, really neat. Part 2, of course, cutting my promo a little shorter than last time. I had some stuff to get off the chest last time. I had to talk about the Charlie Hebdo cartoon, my appearance on the Big Picture Show on the RT. I want to give much love out to the producers of the Tom Hartman Show and also Ring of Fire Radio, Mike Papantonio, Ferron Cousins. They emailed a brother and said, hey man, you want to sit in? So much love to them. That was just a wonderful and great opportunity. And I hope I represented well for the good fans, friends, and supporters of We Are Respectable Negroes, ChaunceyDeVega.com, and the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. So I just want to send some love out to that. And also thank everybody again who sent me nice emails and said, hey man, you did a good job. That really meant a lot to me. So part 1, as I said, we talked about Biggie. Part 2, we're talking with Mickey Hess, professor at Rider College. There's a great new book out on the one and only, the man, the myth, the legend, he who has no father to his style, the one and only Old Dirty Bastard. And this was just a wonderful conversation. I got to be honest with you. I always try to shill for the guests on the show because we have some really cool, smart, fun, interesting people doing interesting things, talking about important and interesting matters. That's the theme here. And I've got some really interesting, cool, smart, interesting people doing interesting things, talking about interesting and smart things and matters coming up. That's me channeling Paul Heyman, the one who put the 21 in 1. Did I get that wrong? Oh, dang. That's how good Paul Heyman in the WWE is, talking about Brock Lesnar. And we are going to talk about the Royal Rumble very quickly. So we've got a nice little twofer here. We have a sandwich of pop culture goodness. We have the 1-2 of Jack Hamilton and Biggie. And then we got Mickey Hess and the one and only Old Dirty Bastard, one of the founding members of the Wu-Tang Clan. And Mickey and I connected, again, the wonders of the internet. And it was such a natural conversation. We'll hear that. We have some shared pain about loss and discovering music again. It's a type of solace, is a type of hug, a musical hug when you have loss in life. And that's what pop culture in its best sense can do, especially music, man. We talked about that. Then talking about corralling cats and trying to sit down, in his case, with the members of the Wu-Tang, Old Dirty's family, trying to figure out who the man was versus the myth, and just listening and sharing stories. And I mean, it was just a wonderful ride. Mickey is a great storyteller. Mickey Hess has written several books on hip-hop music and culture, cultural studies more generally, but his new book, which just came out in November 2014, On Stage, in the Studio, and in the Streets with Old Dirty Bastard, it was really great, as I said, for him to be so generous with his time. He just came off of a book tour in addition to his teaching responsibilities, and we just ran the gamut in terms of talking about Old Dirty Bastard. And I think fans of hip-hop will certainly enjoy the conversation. Fans of ODB will really enjoy it. And if you're just interested in mercurial, little understood personalities from music or American popular life in general, you're going to like this conversation. I always try to encourage folk. Yeah, we have the great conversations here on the podcast that are explicitly about race, politics, and the color line. We also have some really cool conversations about music. I have even more recorded, set, and ready. I may drop one next week as a surprise. Really cool band that I spoke to. Also have some great conversations about comic books. Another great conversation that more people should listen to with the great Box Brown about graphic novels, comics, and the life and times of the great Andre the Giant. So even if it doesn't seem like it's your thing, you're like, I'm not a hip-hop head. I think Old Dirty Bastard was a crazy man I saw on MTV going to cash his welfare check in a limo. Just listen to the story, because a great story is just a great story, and it stands on its own. It's almost like the monomyth. There are certain storytelling styles that are across genres, they're tentacle-like, and we see them repeated over and over and over and over again. And also the idea that there's certain stories, Star Trek, Star Wars, and others, and Doctor Who probably, I'm sure, for the Whovians out there. I ain't a Doctor Who fan, although I do like the Daleks. I call them Daleks. I don't care if people say they're Daleks. They're the Daleks. They're some bad dudes. I'm not so much for the Cybermen. I don't like their minimalist aesthetic. But you can also include them in the monomyth in the sense that those are stories that are told in almost every type of storytelling style, drawing on almost every trope, and they are intertextual. So there's my cultural studies, literature studies, mythology studies moment for you. So looking back, because I have to do it, because I mentioned it on the website, our Ghetto Nerd moment of about a week ago where I was writing about the Royal Rumble, WWE, I will just say one thing. If you are not a wrestling fan, you should still watch it online. The championship match, Seth Rollins, the one and only Brock Lesnar, and Super John Cena. I don't like the guy's work. I don't think he's very good in the ring, but I cannot disrespect his effort. And he has really carried the company on his shoulders for so long, and I got to give nothing but love to him for that. 4-star classic. Check it out. It was wonderful, and I made my predictions on the website. And thank goodness Brock Lesnar won. But the more interesting thing is, and was, the Royal Rumble. So the Royal Rumble, for folks who don't follow it, everybody comes out in a certain order. The last number is the best. The lowest number is the worst. And that makes for great storytelling, because some of our best people have come out number 1, 2, or 3 and lasted the whole thing. Some of our best people have come out at the very end and lost. So it's really, really, really neat, this false pretense of randomness. So the Royal Rumble was not very good, because the WWE is in a horrible position. You cannot convince people to like you. I think that's true across life. It's even more true in entertainment. And wrestling is unique, and they had some great stuff on the Bleacher Report, some other great websites talking about wrestling, and they pointed out something about wrestling I had not really thought about because it's so obvious, but it's still a genius insight. That the feedback is immediate. People cheer, boo you. And it's like watching a film or a movie. We know it's not real. There's a bargain between the cultural product and the viewer. It's not like watching the Super Bowl, which I will make my prediction very shortly again, my beloved New England Patriots against the Seattle Seahawks, where a sports fan can say, oh my God, this is real. This person is just messing up. I'm going to boo him. It's all scripted. And that's why it's beautiful, because then it's like, man, the quality of the performance, the quality of the actor. And wrestling is real. And I get really upset, like a lot of folks do, when you say wrestling is fake. Wrestling is real in the sense that it is physical storytelling. You can't fake breaking your neck or your back or your legs or tearing up your knee. You just can't. These are folks who fall for a living. And it exacts a horrible, horrible toll on them. Never mind someone like Chris Benoit who kills his family. Never mind people who drink themselves, medicate themselves in other ways, and then crash their cars and kill themselves or commit suicide. Wrestling is real in that sense. So they have somebody that they're pushing. His name is Roman Reigns. Handsome, athletic, royal family in terms of wrestling. He's one of the Samoan brothers. So many people. Afa and Sika, High Chief Peter Maivia, The Rock, of course, Jimmy Superfly Snuka. So many great folks. And he has that pedigree, so they're going to make him the champion. The problem is he's boring. His moveset is limited, and his promos stink. He can't talk on the mic. So he wins, and they bring out The Rock. And as I said, watch this online. I actually think ESPN may have covered it. They bring out The Rock to try to save this whole thing. And The Rock does the pouty doo-doo face because even he is shocked by the hot mess he is brought into as boos rained down on Roman Reigns. Rained down on Roman Reigns. Is that alliteration? I gotta ask the great Leaping Lanny Poffo. And if you haven't heard his interview, that's Macho Man's brother on the Chris Jericho show. You gotta listen to that if you like good storytelling. It really brought a tear to my eye. I was listening to it on the bus and I was like, oh my God. This is some of the most honest, real, and raw stuff I've ever heard in Macho. You probably know him. He was a legitimate popular culture phenom for his commercials and his voiceover work. But if you can, just go to Chris Jericho's website and download it. So WWE has written themselves into a corner. How are they going to get out of it? And here's my very quick 2-cent thought. So you got a guy who's really unpopular in Roman Reigns. What they got to do at WrestleMania, because it's inevitable at this point, is they got to make him a heel. The people want him to be a heel. The people are booing him. The great Brock Lesnar, and I'm a huge Brock Lesnar fan. So they got to turn him. And if Brock is leaving, because Brock basically at this point is a face, non-fans of professional wrestling means he's a good guy. And how can you not love him? He's an amazing athlete. He could have succeeded in any sport. He was an NCAA champion, UFC champion, WWF champion, a phenom who probably would have been really good in the NFL, but he didn't want to go to Europe and play and come back because he was just a little bit behind in terms of not having played the sport in college, I believe. So he kicks people's behinds. He doesn't lie. He doesn't cheat. He's direct. He's not slimy. He's not duplicitous. How can you not cheer him? He beats the hell out of everybody in front of him. So the fans are coming around. So Brock is leaving. Here's what you got to do. Jim Ross has talked about this. Others have talked about it. I've been saying it for months. Do the double turn. Great WrestleMania moment where this happened with Jake the Snake Roberts and Honky Tonk. Jake talks about it all the time. Old school wrestling fans will get that illusion. Go into WrestleMania. Have Paul Heyman be the X Factor, one of the greatest managers now of all time. At some point during the match, he looks left, he looks right, because he's a mercenary, and he decides to go with the younger guy, and he goes with Roman Reigns, helps Roman Reigns defeat Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar leaves. Disgusted, hurt, upset, betrayed because it's his best friend. Now, if Brock stays, you have a natural storyline. Betrayal. Reigns doesn't have to talk because he's a horrible talker. Is just non-charismatic. And people say, oh, he has a lot of personality. He's a lot of fun on the road. Maybe it's the way they script the promos. I don't know. But at this point, he just stinks. So he's got to fix that. But in the interim, Paul Heyman can mentor him. Help him get better on the mic. Then at some point, maybe he can betray him and you have a natural rivalry if Lesnar stays. So you have betrayal, you have friendship. And there's one of the other problems now with the booking is a lack of emotional content. You have to have a reason to believe that these people like each other or hate each other. That's simple. Now, another dream match, if they can figure it out, I don't know how they would get to it at this point, given that Brock Lesnar has won, unless they do something with Seth Rollins getting the belt and cashing in the Money in the Bank, is to have a matchup David Goliath, where you have Daniel Bryan, the awesome Daniel Bryan, who's super over, going up against Brock Lesnar, and that would just be a clinic for all time. So my Super Bowl prediction, as a New England Patriots fan, as I stretch, and I've been a little tired this week, because I think Bill Belichick, the succubi-like genius that he is, has his tentacles in all of the Patriots fans. Patriot Nation is being drained of energy. It's not a big teddy bear. My friend Teddy, you've seen him on the website. He likes to drain energy too. But it's Bill Belichick. And because I am part of the Patriots Nation, I have surrendered. All hail Belichick. All hail Belichick. We kneel before Zod. I think, and I'm not a sports stats junkie, I've been reading that stuff. I know the time of possession. And I have no opinion about Deflategate. Frankly, I don't care. It had nothing to do with the outcome of the game. Every team does it. Belichick knows where the bodies are buried, and they are not going to touch him. Because you know what? He's going to tell everybody's business. So I think on ESPN somebody said, the Patriots would have won if they were using bowling balls, tennis balls, duck pin bowling balls, stones or rocks when they played the Colts. So I think we have two outcomes. I know this is not a genius insight. I want to go to Vegas and do the over-under. Whoever has the last ball wins that game. That's simple. I know they did the Madden simulation where it went to like double overtime and the Pats won on a field goal or something, I think. And the other X factor, again, if you beat up Brady and keep him on the ground and you keep blitzing him and the Seattle defense is awesome, game's over. But let's assume that doesn't happen. Other Y factor or X factor or Z factor is Blunt force trauma. If we can get him going for the Pats, another deciding factor, that game's going to be over. Never mind Edelman, Gronk, all the other weapons. They come down between two very evenly matched teams. You match up really well on paper, and it's the last team that has the ball. I think it's going to be that simple. That simple. And it's going to be a show. So without further delay, Mickey Hess, Old Dirty Bastard, Chauncey DeVega, sitting down talking about his life and times hip-hop, the Wu-Tang Clan, Old Dirty Bastard's adventures, being a superhero lifting cars off of kids, his drug use, his relationships with his family, Old Dirty Bastard's adventures and love of McDonald's. That was fun to hear about Old Dirty Bastard and McDonald's. And a really sort of humanizing moment about Old Dirty going to prison. And how Old Dirty, you hear it in my voice, he was not surrendering to this black hyper thug masculinity nonsense. He was scared. And how he was put on antipsychotic medication while in the jail. Great, great, great conversation. Mickey Hess. Second episode 2015. Here on the podcast known as The Chauncey DeVega Show. I do think you'll enjoy it.
Oh, baby, I like it raw. Yeah, baby, I like it raw. Oh, baby, I like it raw. Yeah, baby, I like it raw. Shimmy, shimmy, y'all, shimmy, yam, shimmy, yeah. Give me the mic so I can take it away. Off on the natural charge, bon voyage. Yeah, from the home of the Dodgers Brooklyn squad. Wu-Tang killer, bees on the swarm. Rain on your college ass disco dorm. For you to even touch my skill, you gotta go to one killer bee, and he ain't gonna kill now. Chop that down, pass it all around. Lyrics get hard, quick cement to the ground. For an EMC in any 52 states, I get psycho. Killer Norman Bates, my producer slam. My flow is like bam, jump on stage and then I dip there.
Hello, Mickey. I just want to thank you for taking the time out to sit down and chat with us about your book on Old Dirty Bastard and Wu-Tang and hip-hop more generally. And I was thinking about Old Dirty. I mean, we're going to sit down and we're going to separate the myth from the fact from the legend. It's sort of this vision quest adventure you had to go on in writing the book and tracking down Old Dirty's families, members of the Wu-Tang Clan, and what that was like. But, pop music grounds us, just like film. It's like comic books, popular culture more generally. In terms of our memories, I was thinking, I forgot what comedian said it. You can look at your parents and you can tell their favorite era or age by the clothes they're still wearing. So for me, thinking about falling in love with hip hop and how being a member of the hip hop generation born in the 70s, a quote unquote self-described ghetto nerd and child of Star Wars, watching UMTV raps, watching Saturday morning Kung Fu. I remember the first time I heard Wu-Tang, and I remember hearing them on a mixtape, and then to see one of their videos, I believe it was on The Box, or maybe it was on UMTV Raps, and finally getting their first CD. And it was like this crystallization, this wonderfully synergistic and intertextual work that's sampling Kung Fu movies with amazing lyricism, amazing production from the RZA. And in 2004, jumping ahead, I remember when my father passed away. My father died on D-Day of 2004, so let's always remember his anniversary. And I remember walking around downtown Chicago. And when people pass who are close to you, or you have these other life-changing events, you retreat to what you know. And I remember I was retreated back to Wu-Tang and listening to Nas and listening to Biggie. And I was in downtown Chicago. My friends and I were going out to a bar or a club. And my friend's like, dude, did you hear? And I was like, no. He's like, Dirty is gone. And I just couldn't believe that Old Dirty Bastard, number one, given how young he was, and we'll talk about this, and sort of his life energy of just always being in the moment, could actually have left us. So what was your experience and encounter with, number one, the Wu-Tang Clan, and how did you decide to write a book about Dirty?
Well, I was in a similar situation, actually. My dad died in late 2003, so he'd been gone maybe 6 or 7 months when Dirty passed away. And I think it hit me really hard, too. I had also been listening to that first ODB album and the old Wu-Tang stuff a lot around that time. I mean, backing up, when I first heard Wu-Tang Clan, it really had this rawness to it that I think hip-hop had lost and continued to lose even more over the next few years after Wu-Tang came out. But that first video, the first single, Protect Your Neck, I mean, what I do, I teach a hip-hop class at Rider University, and what I did this semester is I actually showed the old Prince Rakim and Genius videos, what RZA and GZA put out before they became RZA and GZA and started Wu-Tang Clan. And, if you haven't seen those videos, they're very like poppy, pop rap, not exactly shiny suit, but the immediate precursor to that. And they're kind of like goofy love ballads, both of them. So I showed those videos first, and I don't think even my students who know Wu-Tang Clan fairly well, I don't think they quite recognized that it was RZA and GZA. So then I said, hey, you know who you're watching here? And then I play that Protect Your Neck, and it's like the absolute antithesis of all that stuff that RZA and GZA didn't like about their first record.
And how do the students respond? You know, I also teach courses on hip hop, and you sort of have obviously the folks who are just the travelers taking a course out of curiosity. Then you have the quote unquote real hip hop heads. And of course, because you're older than 25, you have to prove your bona fides and you have to assert yourself. Be like, hey, you know what? I was here when this began, if not before. So how do the students, number one, respond to Wu-Tang? Because the hip hop heads, they know about Wu-Tang, right? They're musically literate. That's sort of, you know, I tell the students on the first day of class, don't say you're in the hip-hop and a hip-hop head if you haven't listened to Wu-Tang, Nas, and I go down the list of obligatory albums. And you get a little pushback. You're like, what do you mean? I've never heard of those. And I was like, well, you need to reassess. And that's why you're in the class, and we're going to have a lot of fun. But of course, you know, the casual travelers could care less. But one of the things that perhaps it makes me feel old is that when you introduce some students to Wu-Tang, and we can broaden that, obviously, Old Dirty, the core albums, even Ghostface, who just had a great album that just came out that I'm really enjoying, his concept album, which is really great and really smart. I'm a little, you know, disturbed, as I said, you know, fun of the podcast is these great conversations between two like souls and two fellow travelers that go where they may, that a lot of students have told me, number one, it sounds interesting, but they actually have to think to listen to it. And they don't want to think when they're listening to hip hop. Have you had that experience?
No, I've never exactly heard that. Wow.
Yeah, I've had more than one student say, you know, they don't get the references, and this is like something you have to listen to. And I was like, yeah, hip hop should be, in this best sense, about lyricism and storytelling and, you know, creative use of musical sampling. And I'm just worried, like I said, you know, with your experience, have you had that with your students? You know, in terms of sort of thinking about changing audiences and generations?
You know, not exactly in those terms and not exactly related to Wu-Tang Clan. You know, we really start the class, we investigate that divide between like conscious versus commercial and, you know, really try to interrogate that whole binary thinking model where you're saying, oh, this collective set of rappers over here are the better ones. And, you know, the other folks may not have as much to say on an interesting level. So, you know, we've had some conversations about, you know, was rap intended to be a political medium? You know, and there's arguments for both sides. Was it intended to be party music? Was the intent to, you know, raise political awareness, raise political consciousness? And one thing we always get into when investigating those contradictions is we look at Grandmaster Flash's memoir, where he talks about when Sylvia Robinson and Sugar Hill Records brought his group the idea of the message, which a lot of people point back to as like the touchstone for conscious rap. That was the first rap song with a message, essentially. And
well, wasn't the Breaks? Isn't that a common misunderstanding, though? Because the Breaks predated the message.
That's true. The Breaks was out first. But Grandmaster Flash says that he didn't even want to do the song. You know, his group was not into it. They wanted to make party music. Essentially, the label thought they could sell it well. And the group kind of went along with it. If you're using that as a touchstone for conscious hip-hop, it's got a lot of commercial complications behind the scenes.
I mean, it also gets to always trying to give a pitch to good work. Cambridge University has a great new collection coming out, the Cambridge Companion to Hip-Hop, that some of my friends and colleagues have chapters to, or rather have chapters in, because you're touching on something really foundational. It's totally related and directly related to thinking about Old Dirty Bastard and Wu-Tang and hip-hop's trajectory, because you have to locate these artists within a broader context, right? We have to have the story in that moment within which to locate them. Thinking about, number one, how do we define politics? And one of the things I've really tried to push back against in my own work is thinking about this mythology about hip-hop's founding nation time, right? The lies and the distortions and how history is read back into events and meaning is read back into events that were really organic. I mean, I tell my students, what was hip-hop before it was hip-hop? Because when Bam was in the park, he wasn't saying we're making hip-hop.
Sure, that's right.
We're making music. And perhaps there's a social and political context because human beings are socio-political by nature, but we have so much intentionality read back into moments that perhaps with some distance we can see where they would end up. But you had young black and brown and other folks who were trying to decompress, right? Trying to fight back against gang culture, trying to enjoy life in the moment of deindustrialization. And we want to say, oh, this is inherently political, but maybe the real and more interesting truth is maybe it isn't in some ways.
Sure.
Maybe it is in others.
That's true. And really, you know, you've got these folks just trying to make music, just trying to make art. So even outside of like the idea of blowing off steam, I think you've got an artist, you know, trying to put out something that he's made himself or that she's made herself. And, you know, artists don't necessarily sit down and think, oh, I'm going to call it this and I'm doing it for this reason. And I'm aligning myself with these other folks who came before me. I mean, that's not always the way it works. Usually those kind of intentions get created after the fact.
But here's a question about Old Dirty, circling back.
Sure.
So thinking about Old Dirty and his many manifestations and his many names, his government name, the names we've given him, the names of his characters, I was thinking about John Milius, a legendary filmmaker. He made Conan the Barbarian, 1980s classic with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he has this story where he said, probably under the influence of some mind-altering substance, that as he was writing the screenplay and the script, he felt that Conan was over his shoulder holding a sword watching him.
Wow.
And that he had to get the story right or Conan would kill him. So you wrote the book on Old Dirty. You've researched his life. You've talked to his Confederates. You've talked to his fellow bandmates and others. You talked to folks from his neighborhood. Do you think Old Dirty Bastard is happy now? Was he over your shoulder watching and smiling?
I hope so. I think it's a good sign that, his daughter Taniqua came out to the book release. She brought her little son, her 3-year-old son Noah, with her. Everyone I've talked to is happy. And I'm glad, because part of the impetus for writing this book is that a book on Old Dirty came out not long after he died. And a lot of people were not happy with that book. Dirty's mother, Cherry Jones, actually she called for a public boycott of it. Dante Ross, who was Dirty's A&R at Electric Records, he called for a boycott of it too. He said he was disappointed his name appeared in it. So part of the impetus was just to kind of get the story right.
And what was wrong with that first book? Was it a hagiography? Was it just, piss poor writing with sources that weren't vetted?
I won't say that it set out to tarnish Dirty's legacy, because I don't think that was her intent. And some people have argued it was, but I don't think so. I think what was really wrong with it is that the author was a little bit in over her head. She was really young. It was her first book deal. She hadn't really written other stuff on hip hop, and kind of from the outset establishes herself as somewhat of an outsider. But the biggest misstep she makes to me is she actually goes to a psychology professor and kind of presents him with some of the facts of Dirty's life, some of the rap sheet kind of stuff, the police record kind of stuff, and basically asks the psychiatrist to diagnose Dirty after the man is, dead and gone, certainly not a patient in a psychiatric setting. And that seemed like a misstep to me. It really gives the book a spin that, this is a person who's suffering from mental illness. And so many of the very creative and outlandish things that Dirty did, both on record and on the street, just are presented under this cloud of mental illness that I think robs him of a lot of agency.
What was Dirty like as a child?
Yeah, Buddha met Dirty around 12 years old, when they were about 12 years old. And he tells a lot of stories of Dirty at that age through, 16 or 17. Just being really into doing music with his family. His mom sang, his sisters sang, his uncles were always playing records. So they basically had their own block parties. And Buddha talks about going to Dirty's house and just everybody would be singing. And Dirty could not sing the way his sisters could sing. His mom could sing. The way Buddha puts it is Dirty couldn't sing, he could sing. He's got that warble to his voice. He's got kind of a Screaming Jay Hawkins thing going on. The way Buddha presents it, a lot of that style came from Dirty trying to steal the show a little bit from his sisters, because they could really sing in a traditional sense. And that's how Dirty became a showman, trying to have his moment in the spotlight when he was faced with so much talent in the family. And, Buddha talks about Dirty just kind of like being a peacekeeper. Really showing a lot of sense out on the corner with Buddha and their friends. He talks about, when the cops would roll up and tell him to get down on the ground, try to arrest him for a beer they have in their hand they stole from the corner store. He talked about how Dirty could just really, calm down the situation, not let anything get out of hand. They had friends who would kind of whine and cry when the officers rolled up, and Dirty would kind of calm down his friends, try to diffuse the situation as well as he could with the officer. And Buddha even presents a story where Dirty keeps the group from having to get down on the ground. He talks the cop out of it.
And thinking, you said something really interesting there about one of the questions around Dirty's performance and his art and his life is this question of agency.
Sure.
So thinking about his drug use, thinking about was he some sort of autodidact? Because I'm thinking, too, about, again, remembering hearing Protect Your Neck, playing on a cassette tape, Enter the 36 Chambers over and over and over again with the friends, driving around the car. Then Return to the 36 Chambers comes out, Old Dirty's CD with his welfare card on, his, public assistance card on the cover. Again, another iconic Old Dirty Bastard moment that we'll talk about. And I remember listening to the album, just listening to it over and over and over again. And to this day, I'm still undecided about, was that just a moment of organic genius? Or did Dirty have to practice to sound that raw and that spontaneous? Because one of the stories I've heard from A&R people doing my own research on hip hop, and one of the stories that comes up repeatedly is that when Old Dirty did that first album, he was actually so high he didn't even remember what he did, which made it really hard for him to actually go out and perform those songs. So was Old Dirty's spontaneous effortlessness, was that practice, or was it real, or was it somewhere in between?
I think it's somewhere in between too. And I've always heard those legends, and in ways, I think I cling to those legends a little bit. It's just like the story of how Jack Kerouac wrote On the Road, the great beat novel. His story was that he wrote it over the period of a couple weeks, just in a speed-fueled frenzy. He just sat down and cranked out this novel. And depending on, which critics you're looking at, people have tried to, discredit that or show like earlier drafts that Kerouac had worked on or later revisions that he made. And, Buddha was able to tell me a lot of the behind the stuff scenes with Dirty. And what really struck me the most is that Dirty wrote rhymes all the time. He was always thinking about what would be cool to say on a song. So what would be cool to throw into some lyrics. And Dirty says, Buddha says that they would just hop in the car and hit the road, and Dirty would be driving and he would be thinking lyrics. It would almost be like, okay, Buddha, write this down. I got this great thing I'm going to put into a song. So I think that it doesn't necessarily detract from the spontaneity because the vocal performance still has that spontaneous flow to it. But Dirty would think of these little snippets of his experience and just like clever wordplay and rhymes and grunts. And he would think about those throughout the day of like what would sound cool to do on a song. And Buddha also shows that Dirty played a decent role in production, as far as like making sure the mix came out okay, making sure it sounded the way he wanted to sound, make sure his vocals had the quality he wanted them to. So I think it was, overall probably a little less spontaneous than the legends I've heard. But the way it comes out, it sounds just so organic, like you described. It sounds like really nothing you've ever heard before. George Clinton said that. He said Dirty brought a cadence to hip-hop that it never had before.
In talking to folk about Dirty, because again, you worked with Buddha Monk and certainly want to talk about that relationship. And just like you said, the book sort of implies, and more than implies, basically says, trying to even get the book written was like corralling cats because you have all these different people that you got to get together to try to get the story right. But was Old Dirty aware of his own mythology? And would he sit back and talk about himself as Old Dirty Bastard? Or would he talk about himself and use his government name? Was he thinking about himself in the third person as a performer, or was he just being himself?
Well, I think he was being himself in a lot of ways. And the book shows Dirty at a couple of key stages really worrying about that collapsing between the performer and the person. There's a point where he just sits down and he's just like, man, I feel like I'm the fish in the fishbowl. I feel like I can't get out of the public eye. And in a lot of ways, you can say you brought this on yourself, Dirty, right? You put your actual welfare card on your album cover. You took your actual wife and 3 kids down to the welfare office in a limousine, pick up the check. There's a point where he does start to get sick of the attention that he asked for and the attention that he wanted. And there's a lot of moments in the book where Buddha talks about how they would leave New York City and head out to a house in Willingboro, New Jersey, which was kind of a place that, they had some other rappers, the Zoo Ninjas and some other folks they could hang out with. Dirty would kind of drive his car in the back of a field back behind the house there, leave his Benz back there so nobody could see he was there. And they basically just wouldn't answer the phone. If Rizzo would call and ask Buddha where Dirty was, Buddha would just kind of say, I don't know. I haven't seen him.
Was he just trying to have that moment of privacy? So was he just conscious of the fact that he's losing himself in fame, or was he actually afraid that he's going to become this exaggerated version of his own persona?
I think, first of all, it was the idea that he was losing himself in fame. That, he couldn't take his kids and go to Coney Island with them anymore without fans running up, people asking for autographs. But at the same time, there are all these stories where he did really love to be out in his own neighborhood. He would go to the fish market in Brooklyn and just hang out. He would walk in and say, okay, I'm not signing any autographs. I'll talk to you guys, but I don't want to sign autographs. And he would just kind of like sit down and have a conversation with people. Eva Reese, who was Wu-Tang's marketing coordinator, their international marketer, she set up a lot of their initial tours outside the United States and in Europe. She told this story at the book release that I wish we had in the book. I wish I had heard this before. But she talks about a show in a small town in Germany. And she said that Dirty came out, signed a couple autographs afterward, and then got the idea that he would sell some of his official headshots from Elektra. And just from the start, Eva is saying, Dirty, this is not a good idea. You know, these people don't have a lot of money. They just paid for your show. You know, you should just sign stuff for free, not try to make a little extra money. But Dirty went ahead and did it. And then at some point it kind of hit him. It sunk in. Oh, man, these people really are poor. At that point, he couldn't tell who'd gotten a free autograph and who'd paid him. So he just said, all right, I'm taking all you guys to McDonald's. He took a crowd of probably 50 people to McDonald's. They were closed when they got there. So he's banging on the window saying, you know who I am. You know who I am. Let us in. Goes in and buys like 50 people McDonald's cheeseburgers.
And there's something so beautifully spontaneous about that, you know, because he could change the story. It would work with Burger King or Wendy's. Maybe it would be a little better if it, you know, if it was some high-end restaurant, he's going to drop $100 a plate or $300 at Nobu for everybody. But he's so real and sort of this working class genius habitus or underclass made, you know, middle to upper class sort of moment where that's where my fine dining is. It's going to be McDonald's or Fridays, and I'm bringing the people there. You're going on this quest to connect the dots, as I like to say, in Dirty's life. And did you have sort of a vision for your research in the book when you began, or was it, okay, I'm going to separate fact from fiction? Or you're just going to go and be a good scholar, academic journalist and tell a compelling story about a man and locate him within his moment. So what was the actual process like? I mean, who did you call first? Who did they put you on to? How did you actually end up meeting Buddha Monk? Who were some of the other principals you actually sat down and talked? And what were some of the surprises along the way?
I guess to start with, my intent or my hope for the book was really to get in all the stories that humanize Dirty. Because I realized, you know, as I sat down to kind of outline the thing before my first talk with Buddha, you know, all I really knew was lyrics. You know, a couple of interviews I'd read with Dirty where he opened up somewhat. And then all of his public media moments, you know, the arrest, the rap sheet, the appearance at the Grammys in '98 where he bum rushed the stage. Mm-hmm. And it seemed like, you know, at the end of the day, we have this guy who lived 36 years, was famous for about the last 10 of those. And for the most part, you know, we have his rap sheet, we have his media blow-ups, and we have his music. We don't know a whole lot about who the guy was. So I actually first got in touch with Buddha through a rapper named Traum Diggs, who's out of Brooklyn. And they came to my class at Rider University as guest speakers. And I had read this first book about Old Dirty Bastard, and Buddha had been interviewed in that. And I'd read, you know, a couple other interviews with Buddha over the years. And so after they spoke to my class, I went out to Houlihan's with Buddha and Traum Diggs. And I started off by just asking Buddha, you know, what did you think of that first book? You know, I wanted to see if he had kind of the same ideas about where he'd rather see it go or what kind of story he'd rather be told. It turned out we were on the same page about a lot of it. So it was just a really good opportunity to co-author with Buddha.
Would you guys just exchange stories? You would sit and he would talk to you. He would write parts. You would write parts and you would collaborate?
Essentially, we'd sit down, turn on a recorder, and tell stories back and forth. You know, of course, he had most of the stories. I had most of the questions. Although I talked a little bit about my perspective as a fan and, you know, tried to get Buddha's take on some of that, especially being a white fan. But we did a lot of it in person. Couple visits to Houlihan's, couple of whiskeys at Houlihan's to get Buddha talking. By the end of it, I actually went to Buddha's house up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and spent a day and night just really trying to hammer out everything that was left. You know, while I was there, he got Spliff Star on the phone from Flip Mode Squad. He got Mook, who was first manager of Wu-Tang Clan, was really instrumental in getting them their first record deal. We talked to Hellraiser from Son of Man on the phone on that same trip. And then we met up with the Zoo Ninjas, actually Kay Blunt from the Zoo Ninjas, who told us the story of Dirty's final arrest, which was, again, at McDonald's. A couple of key moments when McDonald's pops up. But Blunt was actually driving the car in Philly when ODB got arrested at McDonald's, which is what sent him to prison for a little over 2 years, the last time he went to prison.
What was he arrested for?
Oh, he had drug charges on him in New York. He had drug charges on him in California. Plus, in California, he was the first person ever arrested for this. It had become a felony to wear a bulletproof vest if you had any criminal record involving assault and battery or weapons charges, anything violent. It had become a criminal offense to wear a bulletproof vest. At that point, Dirty had been shot a couple times. So, of course, you know, with everything going on in the East Coast, West Coast battles at that time, too, he was going to wear a bulletproof vest out in California. Wu-Tang stayed mostly out of the East Coast, West Coast, or completely out of the East Coast, West Coast beefs, but still, Dirty had to watch his back. He was the first person arrested under this James Guelph Body Armor Act, which just a year or two ago was actually repealed as unconstitutional. So he had a lot of charges he was facing on both coasts at the time. He escaped from rehab out in California. This was the moment where he was on the run for a couple weeks, and he appeared on stage at the Hammerstein Ballroom with Wu-Tang Clan.
One of his legendary performances.
Absolutely. Did a couple songs on stage and made it out of the venue uncaught.
And when you were sitting with Buddha Monk, I'm thinking again, I mean, so much to say about Dirty and memory and legend from myth. Was there a moment there where you sat with him and you were approaching him and asking questions based on what you thought to be the authoritative truth based on your research, and Buddha was like, nah, that's simply not true?
Sure.
Or no, this, you thought X and the real story is Y? And what was it like talking to someone who was so close to him? I mean, was there still reverence in his voice for this idea and this figure that we know, the public figure of Old Dirty Bastard? Or was it just like somebody reminiscing about a good friend?
You know, Buddha has total reverence for Dirty, and he did correct me pretty quickly on a couple of my misconceptions. And, you know, those pieces of the legend that are out there that just simply aren't true. You know, Buddha never pulled any punches as far as correcting me or disabusing me of that misinformation. But, you know, aside from the reverence that he obviously still shows for Dirty and feels for Dirty, I got him to talk a lot about the moments where Dirty was just a pain in the ass. You know, some of my favorite parts of the book are where, you know, Buddha is just left holding the bag, whether it's Dirty skipping out on studio sessions that Buddha was engineering or working in production. Buddha's left in the studio holding the bag, to where RZA and other folks started to see Buddha as Dirty's keeper. You know, when they wanted to know where Dirty was, they called Buddha. And after a while, that's going to wear on a friendship. Other moments, you know, where Buddha thinks he's going to get his own solo record deal with Elektra, and RZA and Dirty are supposed to go in and vouch for him and talk about how they'll be involved with the album, and that meeting just never quite happens. And Buddha is just like, fuck, man, I've spent a lot of hours, a lot of years working so hard behind the scenes with this guy, this friend of mine that I grew up with. And now I'm being kind of left behind. I'm not getting anything out of this. So there's a couple chapters of the book where Buddha goes into like his decision and his process of becoming a solo artist. He never exactly left Dirty behind in any sense, but just having to stand on his own and become Buddha Monk as an artist, and not just Buddha Monk kind of behind the scenes of Old Dirty Bastard.
Gladys Knight can replace the Pips, you know, and you're in the shadow, or they're your friend, you know, and you're riding in their orbit. But at some point, you want to go on your own, and then you have to have that moment of realization, and it happens more often than it doesn't, that maybe you don't have the intangibles that this other person has.
That's right, yeah.
So then how do you swallow your pride and say, my God, I'm better off as a moon in Old Dirty's orbit or in Jay-Z's orbit, as opposed to trying to be the center of the solar system because I just ain't got it.
Yeah, I wouldn't say Buddha ever actually reached that point. You know, his first album, The Prophecy, came out in 98. It was on a German label, which is probably why we didn't see quite as much attention for it in the U.S., but he really sold a lot of records in Europe. And, you know, still today, there's a lot of rappers in Europe and really all over the world asking Buddha to do guest verses or appear with them on stage. He still tours a lot in Europe, too.
So that probably added a lot to his frustration because he had the proof.
Yeah.
He had proof of life.
That's right.
And all he needed was Dirty and the RZA to sit down with an A&R person and say, hey, we made all this money for you. Give our friend a contract.
Yeah, that's basically the way he presents it. And somehow, you know, that meeting just never happened. He feels like he got passed over at Elektra and the deal went to Rampage, the Last Boy Scout. He feels like that was supposed to be his deal and it went to Rampage.
And what were one or two of the biggest misconceptions that, you know, he had that side-eye corrective moment where he's like, no, you believe this, brother, but the truth is something else. Can you share some of those?
You know, number one was the point at which the drugs were really starting to take over. You know, to Buddha, I think that obviously there was the addiction problems with Dirty. He thought even on the first album that drinking made him a big part of what he was in the studio. He talked about his drunken style, being the drunken master.
That's right.
But when cocaine entered the picture, you know, Buddha even says early on, there was, you know, from about halfway, I think, into that recording of the first album, you know, Buddha talks about the first time he saw Dirty do cocaine. It's actually upstairs at Dirty's grandmother's house. And Buddha is kind of like, yo, what's that in your bag? It's the first time we'd seen him with it. And you get the sense, like, knowing, of course, what happened to Dirty and that he died of a cocaine-related heart attack in the studio, that scene looks really ominous. The scene looks really scary. It looks like the beginning of the end to us as the readers today. But to Buddha, sitting there in 1994, I believe, it's easy to see how you don't see it as that. It's like, okay, cool. Let's get high. And then what Buddha really blames for Dirty's demise, if it's drugs, he blames the antipsychotics they put him on in prison. And I know that a lot of Dirty's family feels the same way. His widow, Iceline Jones, believes that he really got on some bad stuff in prison. He was put on an antipsychotic called Haldol, which is one of the oldest antipsychotics. And you don't really even see it prescribed much outside of prisons today. It's very effective. It just zonks you right out, and it's very cheap. It's been around forever. The side effects are really bad. It causes people's jaws to clench and twitch. It gives you something called the Haldol shuffle, which basically kind of like slows down the way you walk, or almost causes sort of a balance issue, makes your leg almost drag a little bit. And Haldol blocks dopamine, so it really just zonks a person out.
Some folks go to jail, and we can separate, again, in hip-hop, sort of the black hyper thug masculinity, authenticity discourse, or folks have to talk about things they haven't done and exaggerate being in jail and exaggerate having fun there like it was going to a party. But how did Old Dirty respond to incarceration? I mean, was he like, hey, I got friends there, I'll just relax? Or was it literally like taking this beautiful person with all this energy and caging them? How did he process it?
He hated it. From everything I've heard from everyone, he was scared to death. He was a target of other inmates. Felt like everybody was out to get him. It wasn't, you might think a rapper goes to jail and everybody's like, hey, old dirty bastard, all right, man, I want to hang out with you. I want to meet you. But not for Dirty. I mean, he was in a maximum security prison. He was put in Clinton Correctional Facility up in Dannemora, New York, upstate New York. So several hours from New York City. His family, Iceland, and the 3 kids, they still made every effort to get up there to see him, if not every weekend, every other weekend. But he was miserable. He really was convinced that other inmates were threatening him. He was attacked by other inmates. He was hit in the face with a payphone. Yeah, I mean, he said that other inmates were threatening to set him on fire in his bunk. He was convinced that people were out to get him.
And was that his paranoia, or was it people trying to, get their reputation by taking Old Dirty Bastard out?
I think it was the second one. Yeah, from everyone I've talked to, it's the second.
Tell us a little bit about the family. What was it like to be married to Old Dirty Bastard? What was it like to be his child?
Yeah, the family has a lot of love and respect for Old Dirty Bastard still today. His sister was actually out at our Brooklyn book release as well a couple weeks ago. Had a lot of conversations with his widow, Iceline, on the phone. Spoke a little bit to young Dirty Bastard, his son, Barsan. And, I communicated on email with his daughters, Taniqua and Shaquita. But, they have some really positive stories about Dirty as a fun dad, a devoted dad, a dad who wanted to be there for his kids. And according to Iceline, the cocaine just took him over. She said there was a point he became a different person. And he was just doing things and saying things and acting in a way that she'd never seen her husband act before. They had been together since they were 16 years old. So, this is a 20-year relationship by the time we reached the end of Old Dirty's life. They were never actually divorced. She's still the executor of his estate, the administrator of his estate. Buddha talks about going out with Dirty for daddy days, where, they would pick up their kids, take them out to Coney Island, take them out and do something fun just to get out of the studio, have some fun with the kids. So there's a lot to say that he really wanted to be a family man. He was in a business and he had a job that really kept him on the road, kept him around the temptations of, here's drugs, here's women, right. Here's alcohol. You're out on the road for 3 weeks. Buddha actually tells a story about the first time they went to London on tour. They actually brought their girlfriends with them. And it didn't end up going too well. But the first trip out to London, Buddha brought his girlfriend and Dirty brought Iceland.
Thinking about, again, Old Dirty, And I'm using that name instead of his government name because we're really sort of talking about the performer,
Sure.
right? This person we're inhabiting and that we, have respect for as a creative worker. And that's the tension. You have the private person and then you have the public person and how they balance those identities. But, Old Dirty, thinking about, for listeners of the podcast, Chauncey DeVega Show, you may not be familiar with this. So go to YouTube. All these clips are online. They're readily available. Old Dirty going to the Grammys in his suit, crashing it because he didn't win the award. Wu-Tang didn't win. You have famous/infamous moment where he goes in a limousine to get his welfare check that was on MTV with his kids. And thinking about that moment, I remember watching it. And I said, I don't know if this is fake. I don't know if it's staged. I don't know if it's more real than real. But there's some affection and love between him and his wife and those kids. And it's sort of, it's not hidden. It's not fake. I'm like, that's his family. And he doesn't have a bit of shame about what he's doing. And then you have, the interview on YoMTV Raps when YoMTV Raps was going off the air when Old Dirty was clearly intoxicated and or high. So when you think about all these great moments that we have, members of the hip hop generation, other folks, not even folks who were into hip hop. I mean, if you were just, in your 20s or teens or 30s in that moment, you remember this stuff because it was all over the news. Never mind thinking about Old Dirty having an FBI file. A lot of this stuff has now come out about the FBI's war on quote unquote hip hop. But when Dirty was doing these things, let's use the example of cashing the welfare check.
Sure.
Again, was it just spontaneous? And he's like, you know what? I have my income from last year. I still qualify to get aid. The government rips people off anyway. The 1% are a bunch of gangsters. I'm just going to get in a limo and I'm going to go do this. Or was it sort of like an Andy Kaufman-esque moment of performance art where Dirty is doing these things, obviously to get attention, but he's also trying to sort of play the audience as well? What was going on in his head? Was it just spontaneity or was he Andy Kaufman or somewhere in between?
People have speculated all those reasons. I think what I always come back to is that there's always a sincerity to Dirty's performance. Like even going back to the Grammys example, he jumped up on stage because he really, truly could not believe he lost.
Yeah, he was pissed. He was surprised and hurt.
Yeah. He really did go out and buy him a suit that cost him a lot of money, just like he said on stage. And how in the world could you think Puffy is better than Wu-Tang? You can hear it in his voice. He's pissed and hurt in a way that looks and appears different to me than when Kanye West jumps on stage. There's a real sincerity and vulnerability there to it that I don't think you see with Kanye West or, other people who've tried to pull these kind of stunts. Yeah,
that counterfactual, Kanye West versus George Bush. George Bush doesn't like black people. I believe he meant it, but he also knew what he was doing strategically. What if Old Dirty Bastard had said the same thing?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. That is an interesting thought. I don't know. Dirty did have a few things to say about George Bush. In little interviews you see him in with Crazy Sam toward the end of his life. Some 2003 clips you can find on YouTube. To go back to the other example, what was he doing when he went to pick up his welfare check in the limo? That question of did he know what he was doing? Going back to the earliest media reactions to that moment, that question really weighed really heavily. And the idea of agency. Dream Hampton wrote a piece in the Village Voice where she talked about calling Torre at MTV and she was just like, how could you let him do this? And Torre's response was, well, he knew what he was doing. He wanted to do it. It was his idea. So, we go back to the idea of, is it performance art? Is it an Andy Kaufman thing? Or is it sincere? Buddha says it's the latter. He says that Dirty thought it would be funny, number one.
And it was funny.
It was funny. He pulled it off. Dirty already had his welfare check on his album cover. And he thought this would be hilarious. And it was. It was really funny. And he also wanted people where he came from to know that there was just no shame in being on welfare. The larger context is that at this time, there was a big movement to change welfare regulations, really restrict and tighten, how people got welfare, how much they got, this whole system. It was a big thing in the media at the time. And just right in the thick of it, here's ODB picking up his welfare check in a limousine. So on one hand, it completely fueled the stereotype and the fire against this, the stereotype of like the welfare queen or the welfare scam artist. But on the other side, Buddha says back in their neighborhood, people loved it. People were just like, wow, I just went down and got my check too. And there's Old Dirty Bastard on TV.
And that's really important too, to think about that cultural political moment about, welfare to work, Bill Clinton's neoliberal assault on the social safety net. Sure. And I'm sure folks have probably written articles about this. And if not, I'll write it down in my article to be written notepad. Thinking about, you have the broader discourse about, the black and brown poor and gender and women. You have the Cadillac, Ronald Reagan's famous, Cadillac driving welfare queens and young black bucks buying steaks on welfare. Then you have Clinton in the same discourse And all the controversy, and I think a lot of folks of this moment who are a bit younger don't realize how controversial it was. That was a major news item that Old Dirty Bastard actually went and picked up his welfare, right? In a limo. That was on ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN at the time. I think CNN had just started. So Old Dirty is, acting in a spontaneous moment, but then he becomes a symbol for taking back and shrinking the social safety net. So what was one of your favorite random Old Dirty Bastard moments that you learned about? Was it the high profile stuff that he did? Was it taking folks to McDonald's? What was a moment where you were smiling saying, yeah, this guy was something special?
You can't get away from him lifting that car off the little girl.
Yep.
Can you tell
folks a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Dirty was recording at Restoration Studios at Restoration Plaza, which was actually where we had our book release. And he was done for the day. He was heading out, and as he was leaving the studio, he's a couple blocks away, and he saw a car jump the curb and pin a 4-year-old girl underneath the hood or underneath the front of the car. And everybody just kind of froze. And Dirty says, come on, let's lift up this car. We can do it. So he grabs like 5 or 6 guys at the corner, and they lift this car off the girl. She's got really bad burns. She's definitely roughed up. He actually shows up to visit her at the hospital later, gives a fake name, goes in, and her older sister, the little girl's older sister, is like, that's Old Dirty Bastard. I know who that is. So it's one of those moments where, this is right before the Grammys, too. This is right before he jumps up on stage and he gives that famous line, Wu-Tang is for the children. And that's the context of that. He had just rescued this little girl. And I know I was in this boat. I think a lot of people didn't know that it just happened. That gets more press today than I think it got right at the moment when it happened.
And you think, as you said, he gets the quote, and just, again, these sort of random life moments that happen to a person who's full of random life energy. The things that happen to us very often are a reflection of the energy in our own habitus that we put out there. What's the book tour been like? What has that experience been like, number one, as a fan and a scholar? Did you have a moment where you're like, oh, my God, I'm talking to members of the Wu-Tang Clan, and I'm on stage with Buddha Monk, and we're talking about Dirty? Did you have one of those moments where you sort of, had to take a step back and collect yourself?
My oh my God moment was the Ed Lover show. We got to go on the Ed Lover show just a couple hours after our book release in New York, actually. Ed Lover show on Sirius XM radio. And just once we got into the studio, I was just like, oh my God, this is Ed Lover. I used to watch him every day on UMTV Raps when I got home from school. I cannot.
Does he still do the Ed Lover dance?
Oh, I didn't do the dance. No. I did get to ask him about No Face, though, which was cool. That was a group he was affiliated with in the early days of Yo! MTV.
And what are some of the typical questions that you get repeatedly?
We get a lot of questions about Dirty's intents and his motives. Some of the same kind of things we've talked about today in this interview. My favorite question, there was a guy in Brooklyn who said he saw Dirty and Buddha play in Paris. And this was like 1995, maybe 1996 at the latest. And he said, Dirty just seemed like he wasn't himself. It just wasn't a good show. It wasn't what I've seen other people describe as an Old Dirty Bastard show. And this guy's question to Buddha was, do you remember that day and what was wrong? And somehow Buddha knew exactly. He was like, yes, I do remember it. I can tell you exactly what was going on that day. So it was really cool to see somebody come out, almost 20 years after the fact, right? We're heading up to it. And just be able to say, yeah, I remember that show. I remember what was going on with Dirty.
And that was just another moment where he was high or intoxicated?
That one was totally different. There was a guy who they met in France and had been kind of hanging around the hotel room all day with Dirty and Buddha. And Buddha had kind of been looking at him through the side of his eyes the whole day. And trying to say, hey, Dirty, I'm not sure we should be letting this guy hang around all day. I don't know what's up with him. And finally, Dirty came around to that same realization, too. And Buddha had to kick the guy out. And on the way out, the guy is just like screaming and threatening. And he says, I'm going to kill you. And so that was what happened. Dirty went to the show like a couple hours after this guy who'd been hanging around all day said he was going to come back and kill him.
So his performance was just human concern and anxiety about a crazy fan.
I think so.
Jumping up on stage and killing you.
I think so. Yeah. He was just feeling a little fucked up that he'd spent the day hanging out with this guy and slowly realized there was something really wrong with him.
And we mentioned it earlier, and I was thinking about, my first instinct was to say drugs or alcohol in terms of Dirty's behavior. And I mean, that's one of the demons that looms over his death, of course. But do you think Dirty's greatness can be attributed to drugs and alcohol, that we would not remember him as fondly if it was not for his struggle with those demons and the creativity that perhaps they unleashed or influenced? Or is that just unfair to Old Dirty Bastard's artistic ability?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that of a lot of artists. If you're going to make that
Right.
argument for Dirty, I mean, you'd have to make it alcohol, at least. You have to make it for William Faulkner. You'd have to make
Yep.
it for Jack Kerouac. I think you'd have to make it for most of the American novelists who've won the Nobel Prize for Literature. You know, a lot of artists have struggled with addiction. It seems to go hand in hand. I even saw a study last year, I was trying to investigate how true that was for writers and, what might be the different causes from a psychiatric or psychologist perspective. But I think, there is something to be said for the certain swagger on the early recordings, especially that Dirty's drunken style gave up. There's that slur to his voice, and it's hard to tell. Maybe he wasn't drunk on every song. It's probably unlikely he was drunk on every song. But he really felt that drinking gave him a certain style and certain vocal swagger that he was looking for. Now, I don't know. With the cocaine, I think I can't say that did him any favors.
How much influence did Dirty have in terms of some of the later videos? I'm thinking about, Baby, I Got Your Money, right? So, there's a story about Prince going into the recording studio, the video production studio, and basically producing a lot of his early videos, which is why, the Purple Rain album and some of the videos from there are just so, groundbreaking in terms of their use of, at the time, special effects. How much influence did Dirty have over using blaxploitation as sort of imagery and clips from the Mac and other blaxploitation films for some of his videos?
From what I understand, he had a lot more involvement with videos from the first album, to the point that even like he did the Wu-Ha remix with Busta Rhymes. Mm-hmm. Some of the girls that appear in that video, he met at a 7-Eleven a couple hours before the shoot and just said, like, you guys are going to come be in the video. But I think with a lot of the videos from his second solo album that he wasn't quite as involved. He was really starting to feel the pressure for the touring schedule and the recording schedule. And he was starting to hang back from a lot more of those responsibilities.
And as we wind down, I mean, you've been so generous with your time. Is how often can you actually sit down and talk about Old Dirty Bastard? I mean, maybe it's a mark of getting older, or maybe it's just the folks who grew up as, members of the hip hop generation are now in a position to write books and make movies about the things we've always been curious about. Because when I first heard about your book about Old Dirty, I was like, yeah, that's a book I wish I had written. Right? Then you say, wow, you know what? We're probably roughly the same age. And now hip hop is in a position where we can talk about the state of hip hop studies and hip hop in the academy. Sure. We're going to see a lot of these great projects where folks are saying, you know what? These are questions I've always had. And now I'm in a position career-wise to actually sit down and write these books, get them published, write articles, make documentaries, and explore how my generational experience is connected to broader political and social questions. But here's a fun question. Sure. Thinking, as a fellow traveler, a fellow student of hip-hop, fellow fan, do you think if Old Dirty Bastard were released today, if he, his albums came out today, or if the Wu-Tang Clan more generally broke in 2013 or 14 as opposed to 1993, do you think they'd have any success?
Yeah, I really think it would. I can't imagine anyone finding that first Wu-Tang album or that first ODB album and not feeling the energy that's on there on both of them. I think it would come out differently today. I mean, Wu-Tang's first album, they self-released the Protect Your Neck single, the 12-inch, by themselves before they had it. So they did go the route that a lot more artists are having to go today, where first you got to get yourself out there on your own, build a fan base, and then try to approach the labels. So Wu-Tang did that in 93, 92. They were out there doing it then. I think today it would be a little different because they'd have to have, YouTube hits and YouTube views, a certain number of Facebook and Twitter followers. I mean, it's a very different industry. But I think they were already showing the origins of that solo rap. RZA and Jizza, again, had already had record deals as solo artists, weren't happy at all with that experience. So they wanted to build something on their own and see how they could take over the industry from there. I think they can pull it off today.
And how do you think people are going to build on your work? Or if you were going to write a sequel, obviously you'd include the stories about prison, but how do you think people are going to use this as a foundation to do other work? Are they going to locate Dirty in another context? Are they going to do the work on prison or take different themes from Dirty's life and build essays around them? What do you think folks are going to do?
That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought too much about that. I really hope that they take another look at Dirty as far as what he had to say and what he lived through. Because I think there's still a tendency, even among people who enjoy his music, to sort of write him off as just the fun stuff. You know, Dirty's fun to listen to, sure, but he never had that much to say. And if you talk to people close to him, they believe he had a lot to say, and he did say a lot in his music. And I think sort of his outlandishness and, you know, the goofy bits that he puts in between songs, you know, where he's seeing how long he can do a throat croak and things like that. He sings Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Sometimes I think that distracts people from what's really going on and what's really being said.
So Dirty is happy. He's smiling. He's grinning with his gold fronts and happy that Dr. Mickey Hess did him justice. So where can folks find you online? You know, what are your future projects? And if they want to see you on the book tour, how can they look you up?
Well, I can be found at Mickey Hess on Twitter. Just go to MickeyHess.com too. You can find me pretty easily. I'm trying to decide where I'm going to go next. You know, I write, I do like more traditional creative writing too. I've done novels, memoirs, things like that, short stories, done a little academic writing. So I've talked to Eva Reese, the woman I mentioned earlier, who's done international marketing for Wu-Tang. And we might work together on something. That might be in my next rap-related book, because I might sit down with Eva and get the story of touring internationally with the Wu-Tang Clan.
And that sounds like it'll be a really, really rich story, because that ties us back to thinking about the DVD of their concert in Amsterdam.
That's right.
And that amazing show with Dirty gets on stage and he just sort of meditates. I don't want to say zones out. And then with this moment of cathartic energy is unleashed.
Yeah.
So Dr. Mickey Hess, I just want to thank you for being so kind and generous with your time to sit down and chat with the official podcast for ChaunceyDeVega.com and We Are Respectable Negroes, known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. I learned a lot. And as I said, it's a rare opportunity to sit down and talk about Old Dirty Bastard. I mean, it's one for the archives, and I think folks are really going to enjoy it.
All right. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
What a great conversation. That 1-2 punch, Old Dirty #2. The setup punch, Notorious B.I.G. last week with Jack Hamilton from Slate.com. Good conversations there. Next week, after the Super Bowl, I will be celebrating. I'll be exhausted. I'll be tired. It was like Pan calling down all of the fairies and nymphs and Dionysus, and we will drink to celebrate the Patriots' victory. And just like in one of my favorite Deep Space Nine Star Trek episodes, we will drink to celebrate the Patriots' victory, or we will drink to celebrate their struggle in memory. Great DS9 episode. Classic, actually. You got some real Klingon action there. So next episode, really smiling now, I just confirmed this a few hours ago, I'll be talking to someone who I think you'll enjoy. He is direct, he is honest, he is raw, he is to the point. You have seen him on MSNBC. You may have read some of his books. He is, as a child actually, teenager I believe, center stage, watching the moment when it was planned, this American derangement where Christian nationalism, Christian fascism, we're going to talk about, trust me, this Chris Kyle stuff. That's on the top of the list of things to talk about, where America became seduced by the Christian right wing. His name is Frank Schaeffer. He is, in terms of directness, as I said, every time I see him, I'm stupefied. And I remember watching him, and he was on Ring of Fire. We were on the same episode. I emailed him. I said, hey, Mr. Schaeffer, expert on the religious right, a man who's written about his own faith struggles, a man whose father was instrumental in the rise of religious right, knew people like Jerry Falwell and others. Let's sit down and chat. And he wrote right back, and he's like, hey, let's make it happen. So sometimes it's that easy in life. So I'm looking forward to talking to him. And I think we're going to have a wonderful, wonderful dialogue. And his new book is called Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God. So we're going to run the gamut again. I love that word. That's one of my words of the day, gamut. Or is it gambit? I think it's gamut. Gambit is an X-Men character. So we're going to talk about Christian fascism, religion, theocracy, the village idiots, as he recently called the followers of the religious right and the Tea Party, GOP, and the Republican Party more generally on the Rachel Maddow show. I thought that was awesome. We're going to talk about Chris Kyle, and I have a series of posts on the website about Chris Kyle. And I want to send some love out to a friend who sent in a very kind donation in response to some of the truth-telling I tried to do with Chris Kyle. And I'm going to ask Mr. Schaeffer about this. Why the heck, with few exceptions, I can think of one or two notable exceptions, are folks not connecting the dots, as I like to say, between Chris Kyle, the American sniper, a fascist sociopath who is a self-styled religious Christian crusader who is unapologetic about killing Muslims, killing Iraqis, in the broader Christian nationalist movement in this country. It's so obvious. I wonder sometimes if people are just afraid. Parrhesia is terrifying for some. Speaking truth to power, telling the truth without fear of consequence. So Frank Schaeffer and I are going to chop that up. That schedule, the conversation is in the books. barring disaster or some unforeseen circumstance, that's going to be the next episode here on the Chauncey DeVega Show. So I'm looking really, really, really forward to that one. And as is my habit, as we close, I want to thank everyone who listens to the Chauncey DeVega Show. I want to thank all the friends and fans of the website. I want to thank all the people who have been guests on the show. I want to thank all of you kind folks who download, tweet, share, put on Facebook, comment on YouTube, because again, we got the YouTube channel now, and that's been a great help. And we're imminently going to be on iTunes. We got 20 or so episodes from the past, and I may or may not post those on iTunes. I mean, the format has changed, but certainly when we get to 10 episodes for season 3 coming up on iTunes, that's going to get us even more exposure, even more listeners. And again, as I always do, I want to thank everybody, because it means a lot to me, and you guys are really the folks who pushed me forward to jump when I was afraid to jump. And that's some good life advice. Jump when you're afraid to jump. I got that from a movie I just saw, and the name of the movie escapes me. Just being honest. So as is my closing, my habit, be well, be happy, be safe, try to do something nice for a stranger, be nice and kind to our four-legged friends, tell someone that you haven't told before or enough that you love them, and call up an old friend. So until next time, this is the eponymously named podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. Be well and be happy, and I'll see you in a week.